Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. And I don't know that there was like one big earth-changing story like, say, a few weeks ago when Oklahoma lost to Kansas State, potentially next week if Georgia beats Alabama, if Clemson were to lose. So I do think, to me, instead of what was the biggest story, I just think the biggest story to me, or at least the most interesting story, was that Alabama-Ole Miss game. And I think if you watched it, you know where I'm going with this, but it was just a surreal, insane game to watch. If you listen to Thursday's episode, I did tell you that I thought Lane Kiffin would pull out his full bag of tricks. I did think that because he has the personal vendetta against Nick Saban, that it would be close, it would be somewhat competitive, and that he wouldn't let his foot off the gas until the very end. What I did not realize is that Nick Saban would not let his foot off the gas either, because he would absolutely have to keep his foot on the gas to keep up with Ole Miss and eventually win that game. It was incredible. It was surreal. It was literally unprecedented. Nick Saban has never had a day that bad statistically, defensively since he got to Alabama. The final score was 63-48. How about this? Two teams combined for over 1,300 yards of offense. Alabama, 723 yards of offense. Ole Miss, over 640 yards of offense. And it was just insane. It was bonkers. And I do think that while most of the national media is probably going to spend today talking in depth about Alabama, their defense, are they in trouble, like all the corny cliche stuff, I'm going to do the opposite. And I think one of the reasons that you guys like listening to this show is because I don't always just take the big, broad, boring topics and break them down in the big, broad, most boring way possible. Sometimes I think there's a story behind a story, and sometimes I think the people in the media focus too much on the wrong story instead of the right story. And to me, the big story coming out of this Monday is not Alabama's defense. I think it's Ole Miss's offense, and I think it's Ole Miss as a football program, and I think it's Lane Kiffin and what he has done in 3 games since he arrived in Oxford. Because while this guy has been really, for lack of a better term, essentially a national punching bag for the last 10 years, dating back to his time as the Oakland Raiders head coach, I think he is proving to be one of the great offensive minds in all of football right now. And when you think about the offensive explosion going on in football, that really is saying something. So when I look back on Saturday, what I don't see is Alabama's defense let's talk Alabama's defense. What I think about is Ole Miss, and what I think about is that offense. And what I think about is what they have done so far this season. First of all, if you look at the 3 games, they're number 2 in total offense in college football right now. Ironically, the only team ranked ahead of them is Alabama, in large part because of what Alabama did. But it's also partly what Ole Miss has done relative to the competition. 600-plus yards of offense against Florida in week 1. Kyle Trask, his whole Heisman candidacy is largely based on what he had to do against Ole Miss to keep up and eventually surpass Ole Miss. 459 yards, 42 points against Kentucky in week 2. By the way, I say it all the time. We got a lot of Kentucky fans who listen to this show, and a lot of you were really frustrated after last Saturday and that loss, and I understand why you were. But what I told you was, this is who Ole Miss is. Lane Kiffin knows that the only way that he is going to beat teams is to score and score often and score in bunches. And so when you look at what Kentucky did last week, 459 yards of total offense is almost 200 less than what Alabama gave up. Also, the 42 points less than what Alabama gave up. And Kentucky had an overtime period in that game. So 459 yards and 42 points against Kentucky. And then on Saturday, the surreal big, broad, headline, lightning strike kind of game where they had 647 yards and 48 points against that Nick Saban coach defense. And I think to contextualize how impressive it is, you really just have to be a pseudo-historian of college football. And I don't claim to necessarily be that, but what I can tell you is I have been watching college football really my whole life, but really on a professional level essentially since Nick Saban got to Alabama. And since Nick Saban got to Alabama, I can comfortably say that I have seen just about every single game that he has coached in, certainly all the SEC games, certainly all the big games, certainly all the playoff games, and I have never seen a singular moment in time like I did on Saturday night when Alabama literally had no answer for what Ole Miss was doing on the offensive side of the football when Alabama was on defense. And when I say that, what I mean is this. Alabama has had bad days defensively, don't get me wrong. But usually when that happens, it's because of a singular, transcendent performance by a singular player, and that player usually almost always is a quarterback, right? Last year there was Joe Burrow. Couple years before that was the Deshaun Watson games, one that Deshaun Watson won, one that he lost in back-to-back national championship games. There was Cam Newton many years ago, and maybe most famously, there was the Johnny Manziel game, which, for whatever has become of Johnny Manziel, was still one of the singular greatest performances that I have ever seen in college football from one individual player. Of course, while those were great individual performances, I have never seen anything like what Ole Miss did on Saturday against a Nick Saban coach defense. And what I mean by that is this. It wasn't one individual player that dominated Alabama. It was the collective scheme, it was the collective coaching, and it was Lane Kiffin having Nick Saban on his heels the entire game. If you watch that game, it was every play. Alabama had no idea what was coming, where to go, where the ball was going. I have never seen a moment or a game where so many plays against an Alabama coach defense where there was just wide open guys. And there were guys catching the ball with wide open space in front of them, taking a 5-yard catch and turning it into 25 yards. That happened on every possession all night long. Again, it wasn't any individual guy. Matt Corral, the quarterback, threw for 365 yards, but Ole Miss also had 2 players rush for over 100 yards each, which is the first time that's ever happened to Alabama. And how about this? 2 receivers with 140-plus yards receiving. And so it's like I said, I have never, ever seen Alabama on their heels being outcoached and Nick Saban and his staff having absolutely no idea where the ball is going or how to stop it. Now, they did eventually outscore Ole Miss, but I don't think it takes away from what Ole Miss did offensively to the point that, I don't know if you saw this, but after the game, Alabama's defense even went so far as to accuse Ole Miss of stealing signals and of having their hand signals that allowed Ole Miss to kind of know what defense was coming. And I'll give Lane Kiffin credit for this. He quickly squashed that. He quickly went on Twitter, and what he basically said was, dude, we didn't have your hand signals. And he goes, even if we did, it wouldn't help us anyway. We play so fast and we are so aggressive that even if we had your hand signals, we're snapping the ball before you're even signaling to your defense what you want to do or where you want to play. And so I give so much credit to Ole Miss because even though they won, even though they lost, I do believe that they are the story coming out of this. And I got to be honest, I think in the bigger picture, it's an incredible story about how quickly Lane Kiffin has completely flipped this program, how he's given them an identity, and how much of a thorn in the side I believe that Ole Miss is going to be for the SEC going forward. Now listen, is this program ever going to be good enough to win a national championship? History says probably not. For people who don't know, Ole Miss is one of only 4 teams that have never made the SEC championship game in the current SEC. One is Vanderbilt, one is Kentucky, one is Texas A&M, who just joined the conference about 8 years ago, and the other is Ole Miss. And so history says that, Ole Miss probably not going to win a national championship. So I'm not saying that Ole Miss is probably going to win a national championship. But when I think about how fast Lane Kiffin has identified or has given Ole Miss an identity, and he has gotten them to play at the speed that he wants to play and do the things that he wants to do on offense, I think about it like this. What is it going to be like in a year? What is it going to be like in 2 years? Because when you look at what happened on Saturday, you have to understand one thing. You got to understand that this is just the beginning for Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. Keep in mind, I looked this up because I wanted to confirm it. Ole Miss did not have a single spring practice last spring in February and March. They were scheduled to start. It got pushed back because of the pandemic, and it was eventually canceled. They get back to campus. They got a bunch of positive tests. They're slow out of the gate having actual practices. And then they jump into the SEC, and in year one, in 3 weeks, they've already put up 600-plus yards against Florida, 600-plus yards against Alabama, and Kiffin hasn't even brought in his own guys yet. Not to mention that the defense is abysmal, and that's going to take an overhaul. But can you imagine what it's going to be like when Lane Kiffin hits the recruiting trail with the tape and with the film of what he just did to Alabama and what he just did to Florida? Are you kidding me? This guy's going to be able to go into the homes of every quarterback, every receiver, every running back, every tight end and say, bruh, come with me. We're going to have fun. You're going to get a lot of touches. We're going to score a lot of points, and you're going to go to the league because of me. And again, if you need me to confirm it, two running backs rushed for 100-plus yards. 2 receivers had 140-plus yards rushing. If your son is a wide receiver running back, you don't think he wants to go play for Lane Kiffin? And I do think the defense will get better because, 1, it can't get very much worse, but 2, because of the fact that eventually you're going to see the dynamics of the offense and say, listen, come play for us on defense. You don't need to be great. We're going to take all the pressure off of you, and you're, of course, going to be showcased in the SEC. And so to me, I know it was a frustrating loss for Ole Miss fans. I know they came out of this game disappointing, but without talking to Ole Miss fans, I got to think that you're kind of excited about Saturday. Now, the defense clearly has to be better. The defense clearly cannot keep giving up 700 yards of offense like they did against Alabama. But 2, the defense also just needs to be better, needs to be more consistent, can't be giving up 40 points a game. But I just don't know how, if you're not an Ole Miss fan right now, how you are not fired up. I know week 1 it was all about Mike Leach. I know week 2 it was all about Sam Pittman. But if you're talking about, to me, the coach that I would be the most excited about if I was a SEC fan base in terms of new coaches, I think you can make the case for Sam Pittman because he's completely changed Arkansas. But I don't know how you can't be excited about Ole Miss. Ole Miss fans are literally sitting here on a Monday morning saying, we got the most explosive, exciting offense in college football with probably the best play caller in college football. And this is just the beginning. We are just getting started, not saying we're going to win a national championship, but it is going to be fun along the way. And so I do want to give Ole Miss a ton of credit.